Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our talk this evening. I'm so grateful to so many of you for taking time out of your busy evenings to listen to what we have to say this evening and to listen to our fantastic guest speaker. For those of you who don't know me, because I know we've got people from across all three schools, my name's Stuart Murphy. I'm one of the assistant principals in the senior school, and I'm responsible for pupil development and wellbeing, which is how I end up here trying to provide this talk for you this evening. And I'm really grateful to those of you who've made the time to watch it, or maybe are watching it slightly delayed through the same Teams link. Before I get into the introductions, I think the one thing I just wanted to point out was that we had over 260 parents respond positively to wanting to attend this talk. And whilst I'm not sure that's something to celebrate, because it sort of indicates the level of worry that there is out there amongst parents, I wanted you to know that, because it means that there are 267 at least other people who feel that they want to know what you want to know and want to know a bit more about how they can support their children, whether that's at the boys prep, the girls prep, or in the senior school. Obviously that's quite a wide range of young people to take in, but I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Jai Adiaru along as our speaker this evening, and you'll be hearing from her in just a little bit. She's a national expert in young people's mental health, and she's the manager and consultant psychologist for the Grenfell Trauma Service for children and young people. And we've been very lucky to have Dr. Jai. I've been very lucky to be able to speak to her at various points over the last few years to learn more and to understand more about how we can support young people's mental health. And she's going to speak to you this evening primarily about eating disorders, because there's such high prevalence, but using that as a general term for the things you can look out for and the ways that young people need supporting. So there'll be some specific information about that, because it is something that is affecting our school community, particularly in the senior school, but it's increasingly prevalent, unfortunately, in younger people as well, and also in younger boys too. But you'll hopefully get some really useful advice about things you can look out for that specifically, but also generally as well about what to look out for in young people through the summer, and what you can do then to act and to help and to support them. Before we do that, though, I'd like to briefly embarrass two really important members of our team who hopefully will appear on the screen if technology allows in just a moment. And I'm hoping you can still hear me at the same time. So I'd like to introduce Fazila Gore, who's part of our counselling team in the senior school, and she's on the left as you look at the screen, or Faz as she's known to the pupils. There you go, she's waving, that helps. And Faz is a child and adolescent psychotherapist, and she works across the senior school, supporting large numbers of our pupils. And some of you may have already, you may know your daughter's already working with Faz, so I thought it was nice to see her. And also we've got Caroline Skollick, and Caroline Skollick works across the preps as a mentor, and she gives great support to the prep school pupils as well. So I just wanted to briefly introduce them before I hand you across to the main attraction for this evening, which is Dr. Jai. And as I've said, she knows an awful lot about a lot of things, and she's been a great friend to our school over the last few years, and I'm sure you'll take a lot away from this talk. There is the opportunity to answer questions. There is a Q&A for this, and Faz and Caroline will take a look at that throughout, and there may be, hopefully we'll have the opportunity then for Dr. Jai to field some of those questions towards the end as well. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to Dr. Jai Adiaru. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart, for the lovely introduction, and good evening. It's great that there's so much interest in the topic of children's health and wellbeing, so always a pleasure to work with your schools. As Mr. Murphy mentioned, I'm going to be focusing primarily on eating disorders, given the prevalence, which I'll talk about in due course. However, a lot of the principles can be equally applied to thinking about children's mental health generally. So what we'll cover this evening is a bit of a brief description about what an eating disorder is, as well as what an eating disorder isn't. Some information about prevalence to help understand the context of young people's mental health, particularly over the last year. I'll be talking a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown, and also thinking with you a little bit about why children develop difficulties in this area. I'll be moving on to share some thoughts about what you might notice, what you can do to help, and really importantly, where to get further help and support. So that's a very brief introduction to quite a complicated topic that I hope to do justice to in the next 30 to 45 minutes. The NHS describes an eating disorder as a generally unhealthy attitude to food, which can take over an individual's life and make them ill. I think the reason that I chose to focus on this particular area is that eating disorders often begin quite early in childhood and through adolescence, but are often not picked up until much, much later. So the population that's most vulnerable to eating disorders are young women aged 13 to 17 years. However, increasing evidence is showing that children as young as 6 have started to really focus on their body image as well as their weight in quite an unhealthy way. The 3 most common eating disorders that you've probably heard of are 3 eating disorders that fall under a diagnostic category. There's a lot of debate and discussion about this in our field around how these criteria are applied in relation to getting help and getting treatment. Anorexia, which you've probably all heard of, anorexia nervosa, is focused on a real obsession with being thin. It's not just about the physique, it's often accompanied with an irrational fear of gaining weight. And what I mean by that is a fear of gaining weight when a child is already quite thin or underweight, and a distorted body image, so thinking that they're fat when they're not. As I said, I've noticed a decrease in the age at which young people are starting to focus on their body image, with often young people in primary school being quite conscious. I've worked with children and young people for over 20 years, and perhaps it's an observation that's anecdotal on my part that much younger children are becoming focused on their weight and their body image. Anorexia is characterized by almost a starvation behavior. So children and young people refrain from eating or engage in purging behaviours, so different ways of trying to remove calories from their body, whether that's through vomiting or in older adolescents using other methods of really restricting the food intake. Bulimia is focused on binging, so eating lots of food in one sitting, and then again trying to expel that food either through vomiting, laxatives, or excessive exercise to try and get rid of some of the calories that are consumed. It can be a little bit harder to spot bulimia as well as binge eating disorder, because I think it can look as though children are eating or that they're just hungry, and often the purging behaviours happen in a way that is designed for people not to notice them. So there is secrecy and denial associated with all 3 of these eating disorders. Clinically, if a child were to see a psychiatrist, there's a category that's called other specified feeding or eating disorders. This is an all-encompassing category that refers to atypical eating disorders. An example that I can think of is a child that might wake up in the night eating a large amount of food at a time when they should be sleeping, and this becomes a regular and healthy habitual pattern in their behaviour. In the strictest sense, each of these eating disorders would probably warrant an hour's talk in and of itself, but I think a brief introduction is helpful in the context of the prevalence of eating disorders, as I mentioned at the outset. Although females are predominantly affected by eating disorders, there is an increase in the number of boys. Those statistics presented there focus on the entire population, which also makes me sort of think about our own attitudes towards food in the context of a society that I think is increasingly focused on what we look like and how much appearance matters. But in the context of mental health, it's probably no surprise to you to hear that the NHS is absolutely inundated with referrals, particularly as a result, I think, of schools being closed over the past year and the mental health and well-being of children across the country really being impacted by that. These statistics relate to eating disorders specifically to highlight how the need isn't quite meeting the demand within the NHS at the moment. So there was almost a doubling of urgent referrals for children to start treatment in the community. That's comparing like-on-like data from the previous year and looking at the lockdown year, as it's referred to in the NHS, between 2019 and 20. So 38% rise in routine referrals and over 17,000 hospital admissions, highlighting the severity of this particular problem. I've noted the ethnicity in hospital admissions because there's a really interesting debate within the field about what particularly contributes to an eating disorder. It is quite a Western phenomenon. We see more eating disorders in more socioeconomically successful communities in the developed countries. And I put a comparative indicator there that in the last year, there was over a 200% increase in hospital admissions from people from a Black African background compared to those identifying as white. I think that's a really interesting statistic because it shows that some of those correlates that impact on children's well-being are impacting groups that were not particularly accessing services previously. You could look at that in a somewhat positive way, if one can, to think about whether the increased awareness about children's well-being and mental health has actually led to an increase in an access to services. But whatever the reason, and we don't fully know, there has been a sharp increase in the number of children seeking support generally and specifically for eating disorders. The same increase in demand is reflected in access to CAMHS services. I think we all know again that waiting lists vary area by area, but waiting lists are up to around 6 months depending on where you live. So what do we do about this? Well, we can think about what can lead to a child developing an eating disorder. At the outset, I want to say it's nobody's fault. There's no blame implied in a child struggling with any kind of mental disorder, let alone an eating disorder. And some of these correlates don't necessarily mean that they are causing an eating disorder, but that they could place a child at higher risk of developing an eating disorder, or indeed a mental health difficulty. So some of these correlates apply to all sorts of conditions such as depression, anxiety, panic, and so on. Having a close family member with an eating disorder really comes through in the literature as one of the key predictive factors. Again, there's a debate around whether that's a genetic correlate or whether it's more to do with social modelling and what we see and observe and learn from our family cultures. The meaning of food really varies from family to family. Meal times look different with each of the families that I've worked with. But what we do know is that if a child has a parent or a carer that has had an eating disorder, they're more likely to develop a similar difficulty with food. As I said, a lot of the correlates run across the different mental health presentations. So the same is true of a parent that might be struggling with depression or anxiety. I think the reason for this is not that necessarily it's entirely genetic. I think it's more about how children learn to manage difficult periods. And with each of the mental health presentations that I work with, I try to think of this as a way of the mind coping with what's going on around us. So when we experience stressful life events, abuse of some description, bullying, the experience of pressure at school or from the media, and particularly in relation to eating disorders, having hobbies where being thin is perhaps implicitly important. So athletics and dancing are particular hobbies that can lead children to have much more of a focus on their weight and then their appearance. These correlates impact on us because when we experience these kinds of stresses, all of us will react and manage in different ways. For children, control over their eating can be a way of coping with some of their difficulties. As I mentioned in the introduction, I think the impact of COVID-19, in my view, is really disproportionately impacted on children and young people. I remember around Christmas time, there was a lot of activity in the media and on websites from many people working in the NHS who were really concerned about the restricted ability to meet that demand in a timely way. And a lot of writers, such as Dr. Karen Street, highlighted the need to understand that eating disorders are often related to a need for control. I don't think we've ever felt as out of control as we have over the past 12 to 18 months. And for many young people, they felt that they lost a lot of control over their day-to-day lives, over their future. And many have talked about needing a focus, which again, related to a context in which exercise and activity was really emphasised, has unfortunately led to a huge increase in eating disorder presentations. But as I said, the mental health and well-being of children has been impacted more generally, and I think some of those factors that I've illustrated on the right-hand side of the presentation have impacted children in many, many different ways. Isolation from their peers has had quite a significant impact, not just on children, but probably on you as parents as well. In my work, I found an increased need for parents to have additional support during this time, with lots of stresses, including homeschooling and economic pressures and uncertainty, impacting on parents probably just as much as it's impacted on their children. Uncertainty is also a factor that can lead most people to want to exert control in domains where they can exert control. And for children, there's been a lot of uncertainty around exam cancellations, missing out on their extracurricular activities, not knowing. I think the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing if these restrictions are now lifted, whether we will have another lockdown, this uncertainty can really lead children to focus on things that they can control. And as I said, eating, exercise and body image has been one area where we've observed an increased focus by children. There's also the impact of COVID on each of your families and whether people have been unwell, have contracted the virus, and the worry and again uncertainty that children experience about contamination and how they may or may not contract the virus. You might have seen this in the school or with your children in terms of behavioural changes at the start of the return to school. Across a lot of the schools that I worked with, there were behavioural changes in children. Some children were really happy and pleased to be going back to a degree of normality. Other children experienced increased anxiety and worry, and that can look very different. Some of that worry might manifest through eating. Other worries might manifest through self-injury, panic attacks, so a whole range of presentations that I think are related to living in a context of prolonged uncertainty. Added to which is the context of provision. I think both in the private sector and in the NHS there has been a reduced access to services. Perhaps it's the first time where a lot of private providers are saying they're at capacity as well. So this makes it really difficult to access services, and particularly face-to-face consultations. I think also the reduced contact with teachers and pastoral care staff in school has really impacted on children as well. So where they might have been coping with support from home and school, not having that day-to-day contact has meant that when children did return to school, a lot of school counselling services have become hugely oversubscribed, and needing to work much more closely with parents to think about how to best support the child. I always throw in a little bit about social media, and I feel like a bit of a dinosaur when I do this, because actually I'm a huge fan of social media, and I think during the period that we've just been through, for many children and young people, social media has been a way of connecting and staying connected with their friends. But there was a report by the Royal Society for Public Health in 2019 called New Filters, which looked at the impact of social media, particularly on young people's body image. And it's probably no surprise to you that their main finding was that overwhelming exposure to ideal body types had a negative relationship with how that child was feeling in terms of their self-esteem and self-confidence. And I think in part this is what perhaps contributes to younger and younger children being more focused on their body image. I'm going to move on to some stats here around social media. So the selfie stats kind of perhaps illustrate what might be obvious to all of us, that most people will compare their body image to what they see in the media. And I think what's interesting is that although more females are impacted by this, it's actually quite a significant issue for males as well. Again, this data draws upon the whole age range, but I think it's really important when we think about family culture and family rituals around food and eating and mental health and well-being generally, that we recognise that none of us are really immune to this. Most of the women in the survey said they were impacted by social media, TV, movies, as well as their significant other, ranking third. For men, the views of a significant other ranked first. And in the significant other category, they weren't just referring to a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or a partner, but significant adults whose, values and opinions really matter. So there are reasons why children may not seek help when they're struggling. And I think that's because, in light of the previous sort of data presented around social media, that there's perhaps a normalization of what we should and shouldn't be struggling with. When it comes to body image, my experience of adolescence is that there's an increased focus on identity during this period. That's perfectly normal. It's also perfectly normal to have a degree of preoccupation about what you look like and how you might appear to others. Again, that's very normal. And so children and young people that might be struggling with this may genuinely not think that they have a problem. And that's where behaviours like disordered eating can become a way of coping. It can be a way of dealing with something that they think is quite normal. It might be quite normal in their minds to be focusing on food and exercise and image. But eating disorders can be an unhealthy way of coping when it's a response to dealing with emotions that are difficult and feelings that are difficult. For example, using disordered eating to cope when a child is anxious or angry or lonely and not communicating instead in a different way. So there's a lot of emphasis on denial and secrecy. And again, I want to sort of highlight this in a non-judgmental way. That doesn't mean that the child is deliberately trying to keep something from you necessarily. It's that there is a lot of secrecy and perhaps shame in the coping strategy that the child may have adopted. As I said, often they don't feel that they have a problem, and there's a lot of guilt and shame around the way that it's being managed, even in children that do recognise that they have a problem. And many children and young people worry that talking to somebody else about their difficulties isn't warranted. I did a survey with an app-based company that I'm doing some consultation for, and they said the overwhelming finding was that most children and young people would like to get help, but they felt that their problem wasn't serious enough, and so they didn't want to waste people's time. And my heart really goes out there thinking how empathic that position is, and what we can do to really reassure children and young people that they're not wasting their time by sharing their concerns or worries with an adult or a professional. So I don't know if you've got your mobile phones to hand, but I wondered what signs you might notice that would worry you. So are there any behaviours that you might notice in your child, any emotional changes or physical signs that would make you worried and question whether your child has an eating disorder? I've never tried this via a Teams link, so we can see how this works. But if you go to menti.com, on your mobile phones if you can. It will then ask you for a code, which is on the presentation. And if you enter the code, you can then enter any responses, which should come up on my side. I'll give you a few minutes to think about that. Oh, that's great. I'll share that with you if I can. Actually, I'll stay in the presentation. I'll read out what we've got. I'll put it up at the end. I don't want to risk the technology. Some of the things that people have been noting are weight loss, absolutely. Baggy clothing, yeah, that's a really good indicator. A child that doesn't feel very comfortable in their body is often wearing very loose and baggy clothing. It's also a way of hiding any weight loss. What else have we got? Skinny friends, yeah, that's really interesting. That makes me think about an observation that is really prevalent on social media at the moment, actually, around groups, particularly on Instagram, if I may name a particular social media site, where groups of children and young people have been exchanging very unhealthy tips about how to get skinny. And this is one of the things that we'll come on to in terms of how do you talk to your child about some of these behaviours, because again, it's not something that many parents would come across necessarily. But there are groups that are promoting very unhealthy body ideals, and social media is a bit of a risk factor there. Controlling food take, yep, non-communicative, absolutely. Isolation, I think that's another good indicator, not just for eating disorders, but more generally, when you notice that your child is withdrawing from their usual circle of friends, or withdrawing from activities that they previously used to enjoy, and spending more and more time by themselves, it's often an indicator that something might be going on for them, an indicator of low mood. Disappearing after eating, absolutely. Thinking about food a lot, yeah. So lots and lots of comments here. Avoiding meal times, absolutely. That's one of the key red flags for me around meal times. We'll talk about that in a sec. Going to the toilet after a meal. Excellent. We've got a very, very well-informed parent group here with us this evening. And comments about appearance. Yeah, I think some of these are really tricky. Comments about appearance is absolutely one thing to keep an ear open for. You know, how does your child talk about themselves? How do they talk about their own body image? Again, indicative of a whole range of mental health presentations, but you know, a fixation on being fat or using derogatory language towards themselves is a real indicator that something might not be right. And restricting certain foods. Yeah, so with the increased trend that I've observed in veganism and vegetarianism, it can be really tricky for parents to know, is this a sign of an eating disorder? Is this just my child making, you know, a decision about their diet? I think when children start to avoid entire categories of food, for example, not eating carbs at all, it can be a bit of a risk factor. Absolutely. Internet searches, yeah, great. There's nothing on there that isn't a warning sign, so that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Very, very well informed parent group here. So I've jotted down some of the things that you might observe. I think your list is way more extensive, so I will share that with everyone at the end. We've covered a lot of those already. And the reason that we'd always advise seeking advice from a GP is because the weight loss can also impact on the child's physiology. So you might see delays in puberty onset, you might see menstruation stopping in girls that have already started their periods. And there is an impact in terms of tummy problems or those kinds of bowel movement difficulties that might not necessarily have a medical cause. But when you're observing that in relation to all the things that you've just mentioned in the previous slide, it can be really helpful to get advice from a GP about what that might mean. So refer to the GP. I say that because the GP is the gateway and also the source of knowledge about which services are available locally in your particular area. There's been a huge push on GPs to be able to speak to parents and provide guidance, because we know that children and young people are not necessarily forthcoming and saying, hey, I'm struggling with my eating, can you help? So your GP should be very well placed to provide you with information about what you can do to help, how you can work with your child to access help for themselves. What you can do is learn as much as possible about the signs to look out for. As I said, you're a really well-informed parent group. I can see that by the responses already, so that's excellent. Some of this cliched advice that most psychologists or therapists will give you is really important. It's important to remember that children develop these difficulties because they don't feel that they're doing well or coping well. And validating them regularly, telling them that you love them, telling them you'll always be there for them, it goes a long way. It really does go a long way, because they often feel that if they disclose something or share something, that they might be seen as somehow deficit. So it's really important to recognise that most children will struggle with something. It's not a reflection on your parenting, it's not a reflection on your relationship with them, but the baseline of having regular validation is really, really important to them. I think the school is very well placed in, thinking about the well-being of children and making them aware that professional help is available to them at school. So just reminding them that the school can be a good place to talk to someone, and that the GP can also provide access to support outside of school. Encouraging their hobbies, despite what I said earlier, there are some hobbies that place children at higher risk. That doesn't mean that they should stop doing them, absolutely not. Athletics and dancing and those kinds of activities are really good for children. It encourages them to spend time with friends and do something that they enjoy. But I think trying to have honest conversations about the impact of those things is really important. So, for example, if a child is involved in a whole range of sports activities, it might be helpful to have a conversation with them about what they need to keep their energy going for those activities, for example, and thinking about what the family's diet looks like and what a healthy amount of exercise looks like. Again, there's no hard and fast rules on this because this varies. I work with lots of families that exercise together. I work with lots of families where there is quite a high level of exercise, and that's not a bad thing at all. It's thinking about how conversations about nutrition happen within a family, about balance, What happens when you're tired or not feeling like exercising? What are the sort of norms in your family about what you think about that as adults, as parents, and how is that communicated to your children? So talking about it, and talking about well-being generally, the sort of the how are you doing question is really important. I think letting your children know that you're in tune with what's going on out there can be a really nice way to open up conversations. So my guidance to parents is often to say, you know, oh, I read an article today about this subject. I wonder what you think about that. That can be a really nice way of opening a conversation, using I statements. You know, I went to a talk about eating disorders and it made me wonder about these behaviours that I've noticed, if you've noticed behaviours in your child, rather than saying, I think you have this issue. So finding ways to open up conversations that are broad and invite the child to talk about a topic that you think they may or may not be struggling with. Preparation is really important. No one is comfortable having these conversations in my experience. I think a lot of parents worry about saying the wrong thing or making something worse. So having a little bit of time to think about, well, you know, am I worried? What am I worried about? How can I bring this up? And helping your child to think for themselves. What is their position on it? If a child says, I'm fat, you know, how would you respond to that? How would you explore what fat means to them and where they get those ideas from, rather than saying, oh no, I don't think you are. So trying to hold that frame is really difficult. Talking about it can feel like a bit of a hot potato at times, but I think that's what professional support can help some parents with. How to have those conversations in a preventative way, how to have those conversations when you think your child might be struggling with something, and how to prepare for those conversations, because a lot of children will shut down initially. You may not get the conversation that you hoped you might get. You might get a bit of an angry or a defensive response, but it's how to keep that agenda on the table, as it were, to keep talking about it. So we said that meal times, somebody wrote this on the signs feedback, that yes, withdrawing at meal times or disappearing at meal times could be an indicator that your child has a difficult relationship with food at the moment. If your child's in treatment, the psychologist or psychiatrist working with your family will provide a lot of information and advice on how to cope with meal times. They'll suggest making meal plans, and they'll most likely suggest that you as the adults prepare the meals. This is because some children with eating disorders actually take quite an interest in preparing the food. Again, it's a way of controlling. A lot of children that I've worked with actually enjoy preparing food. They like cooking, they prepare food for other people, but they may not eat it themselves. Or they might pick at it and not, you know, really seem to enjoy eating. So if you're working with a professional, they'll provide a lot of advice and guidance on how you as a family can start to really focus on meal times and what to do, how to prepare, how to encourage a child to join you at meal times, and to look at the family's eating overall. It can be really difficult if a child gets up and leaves. I think, again, this is where support can be helpful for parents about what do we do? Do we let them go? Do we get into an argument in the middle of a meal? Do we ask them to come back? There's no sort of one rule that fits every family, and that's where professional help is really important, because it's going to help you figure out what works best for your family. I think keeping the expectation that meals are important and meals are there as a family activity can be really helpful. And often, to avoid or try to minimize the behavior of disappearing after a meal or going upstairs or perhaps vomiting, moving into some kind of distraction strategy can really help distract children from that urge. But ultimately, don't worry if a meal goes badly. Move on, try again the next day. there can be a lot of pressure when a child is insistent that they don't want to eat the same thing as everybody else, or that they're not hungry, or that they find reasons to avoid mealtime. So this is a really tough area, and you wouldn't be expected to be able to manage this on your own if your child was struggling with an eating disorder. So I've focused a lot on support for yourself. My little cartoon here reminds me of what they tell you on the aeroplanes. Put your own oxygen mask on first before you put on your child's oxygen mask. I think if a child is struggling with any kind of mental health difficulty, it can be really tough on parents. You know, there's no guide out there on how you should respond. I think it's really dependent on your child and the two-way impact that you have on each other. You know, a child's difficulties can really impact the entire family, and their response impacts your response. So there is a two-way relationship here. And I think parents do need a fair bit of support in how to navigate issues like panic attacks, eating disorders, self-harm, depression, anxiety. You're not expected to know what to do, but there are lots of avenues of support. Again, I refer back to the GP because they usually have a pretty extensive list of support available in your local area. But there are lots of online support groups, particularly for this presentation, but in terms of a good place to start. So an online support group might not be the midterm intervention that suits your family, but it's a good place to start, I think. There are lots of resources available online. And as I said, in terms of how to start a conversation, being well informed and having some knowledge about the topic can be quite helpful. So I've outlined a few examples there. Young Minds, for example, and Beat have a lot of great handouts and brief information that can help you understand how you might start having a conversation about this with your child. There's also some great resources on there for children as well. So that's been a whistle-stop tour of a really complex presentation, and I wanted to leave enough time for us to have the opportunity to discuss any feedback. So you can use the same Menti link, or you can just ask me right now. So if you have any specific questions, you can speak to the school's pastoral care team, your GP, or get in touch. But if there's any questions you have right now, we can review them on the Menti. And if we don't get to all of them, I'll provide some feedback via the school to make sure that you get a response to any queries you have on this subject or the general subject of mental health and well-being.
Hello, Dr. Joy, it's Caroline here from the Girls Prep.
Hi.
A question really regarding the younger children and not necessarily related to eating disorders, but self-harm is becoming more prevalent in the younger age group. And what advice would you give to parents to support their children to better manage their emotions?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Self-harm, again, is a symptom. So there's often an underlying emotional issue that the child is struggling with. When a child is self-harming, again, it's a coping strategy. It's not a particularly healthy coping strategy, but they're trying to find a way to deal with something that's difficult. I'm always cautious of generalizations because children self-harm for many, many different reasons. It could be that when they're feeling anxious, they engage in self-harming and there's a momentary feeling of relief. It could be because they feel very low. A lot of children talk about feeling numb, feeling nothing. And then if they harm themselves, they feel something. So there's a lot of different reasons why children self-harm. The advice I would give to parents, again, is probably in parallel to what we've talked about here, is pause. First of all, pause, don't panic. I think there can be a lot of emotion that evokes in the parent. So have a think about what it's activating in you as a parent. You're likely to feel worried. You might feel panicked yourself. You might feel anxious yourself. You might feel that somehow you should have picked up on it. There's a lot of emotions and feelings and thoughts that are activated in parents. So pause and have a think about how it's making you feel. Pause and have a look at some of the literature out there. Young Minds is a good place to start. They have a lot of information, and I think understanding can be really helpful to then having the conversation. So pause, think about the impact on you, put on your own oxygen mask first, think about what it's doing to you as a parent, find out some information. And then 3, try and have the conversation. As scary and as difficult as it might seem, try and have a conversation that begins with an I statement. I don't really understand, but I am here to listen. I am worried about you, and I wonder what we can do. So I always start with that I statement. You're positioning as a parent that you're worried. You don't need to have all the answers, that you would like to think about what would help the child. And that question can go a long way. A lot of children will say, well, you know, I don't want to speak to anybody. Well, then my next question would be, I think it could be really helpful. I wonder what it would take for you to think about that. Just have a think about that. Get in touch with other parents, get in touch with the school's pastoral care team. When we get into the interventions, what we're really asking the child is, we do need to get some professional help here, but I wonder if in the meantime you could at least think about it. Could you think about telling me when you're feeling that way? So that children start to recognise what the trigger is. I think a lot of younger children might not necessarily be aware that I feel like this and then I do this behaviour. So as a parent and even as a professional, our job is to try and increase the self-awareness, help the child understand what's going on inside them, what's the trigger. I don't know if that answers the question, Caroline.
Thank you very much. We've got some more questions as well.
Yep.
Question from parents. What would you advise if the father and mother have different opinions on how to deal with an issue?
I would say that's very common. It's very common that parents have different ideas about how to deal with any difficulty, and it's not uncommon for parents to have differences of opinion about all sorts of parenting decisions. So I want to normalise that first of all. That's where I think, again, looking to what works. You know, I always am guided by the research, and what the research tells us can be helpful. I caveat that by saying there's no one size fits all. So maybe have a look together on some of these reputable websites, the NHS website or the specialist mental health websites, about what would work. That doesn't mean that you're going to agree. It means that you're checking out different sources of evidence, and the research is one source of evidence. Another source of evidence that parents often draw on is their own experience of parenting. You know, we can look at the research, but we can also say, well, you know, I didn't have that, or my parents did this and that seemed to work for me. So that's your own anecdotal experience, and it's equally valid. And I think talking to a third person, a neutral party, a professional, or you can go and see a GP together to weigh through those different options, can be a helpful way of trying to come to a middle ground. In my experience, there usually is a middle ground. There's a little bit of that Venn diagram that overlaps. Even when parents have very different opinions about what would help, they usually have a number of shared ideas about what they'd be willing to try out. And that's the area that we like to work within, where there's more agreement than there is disagreement.
Thank you, Dr. Joy. We've got another question back to eating disorders.
Yeah.
Any tips on balancing encouraging kids healthy eating, such as reducing sugar and fried food consumption, without making them overly focused on food?
Yeah, that's a really tough challenge. Honestly, I think it's a really tough challenge because there has been an increased focus on healthy eating. Then it's no surprise that children are quite obsessed in some ways about sugar content and calories and things like that. So my advice would be, if you're worried, speak to a nutritionist. Healthy eating is balanced eating, and my general rule is not to deprive a child of anything, but to moderate. And it's tricky. There isn't a sort of clear answer here. The caveat is, if your child is displaying concerns around food. So eating healthily is fine. I think it's great if children are aware of healthy food and non-healthy foods. I was working with a child of nursery age, actually, who was talking about good foods and bad foods, and it's something that his nursery was focusing on, that pizzas are bad food and carrots are good foods. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. This is not a way that I would advise a child understands food. But thinking about how everything is okay in moderation. And it is about moderation. So, you know, when we think about our own eating habits, if we're trying to eat healthily, we probably are reducing our sugar intake. We probably are thinking about things like our alcohol intake as adults. And so having some awareness is helpful. I think it's when a child freaks out, for example, if they've had an ice cream, that's when you should be worried.
I think that's the end of the questions there, Dr. Jai. I haven't seen anything else come in on the Q&A. So I think that, yeah, I think we've gone through all of them. I'm not sure where the screen is at the moment and who you can see, but anyway, I suppose I think that brings us to the end of this evening. And I just wanted to say thank you, firstly, Dr. Jai. Thank you for giving up your time for this. Thank you for your advice as well. Thank you especially then to the parents who were putting those questions in, and also obviously to Caroline and Faz for passing on some of those, and Caroline asking a question of her own. I think that there's a lot of good advice there about the general things that you can do to support your children, and the thing that rung true to me, and I'll remember for my own son, is to just to talk to him, just to ask him how he's doing, and definitely the idea of pretending I've read something that prompts a conversation is one that I will certainly bring to the fore if I need it. So I'm really grateful for that. Thank you. For those parents who may have joined us late, or those parents who know somebody who didn't make it this evening, they can watch the whole talk from the beginning by clicking on the same link. Also, based on some of the things Dr. Jai has said this evening, I'm going to try and put together a letter tomorrow, which reminds people of the link and some of the websites that were on the presentation. And also, obviously, within school, we've been promoting websites like Kooth to the pupils. We've also got our Healthy Mind Toolkit and our mental health pathways document as well. So I'll be sending a reminder out, I think, via the MIS on Friday, and seeing if we can put some of that useful information into one place for everybody from year 5 all the way through to year 13. But once again, Dr. Jai, thank you very much for talking to us this evening. And thanks again for everyone for attending. It's much appreciated, and I hope that everyone has a good summer.